Good morning. We are reading The Mystery of History, Volume 4. We're on page 49. We were looking at the Part 1 of the American Revolution, 10 Steps to the American Revolution. Number 1 was the Boston Massacre. Number 2, Caleb, do you remember number 2? The Boston
Tea Party.
Good. And number 3 now we're going to talk about is the First Continental Congress. Okay, so last time, the Intolerable Acts, which the British Parliament actually named it the Intolerable Acts, passed those in response to the Boston Tea Party. And now let's see what's happening. Tension and despair were growing in Boston because it was a harbor town. Because Boston had been closed to all trade and business, and nearly everyone there depended on the trade business, and it had been frozen from this act, the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Word spread to the other colonies that the British Parliament was punishing Boston. As a result, representatives from every colony except for Georgia met together from September 5th to October 26th in 1774. This was in Philadelphia. The historic...
Philadelphia.
Yes, this historic gathering is called the First Continental Congress. It was historic because it brought together, for the first time, members of almost all the colonies. If you remember, Benjamin Franklin attempted this kind of Congress earlier, but his idea was shut down. Remember, he had that picture of the cut-up snake, which is weird that he would envision us as a snake because snakes are a picture of evil. Could you please stop while I am talking? But now they are realizing that what he said was true, that they needed to be united if they were going to get things done. Yes.
I was thinking when you said that they closed all trade, I was thinking that sort of like them disciplining the colonies. Since they did the Boston Tea Party.
That is what they're doing. They're trying to teach them a lesson. But that's not their responsibility because they're not the colony's parent. The colonies are supposed to be a part of Britain, which is why they're getting ready to be so upset. If you have something to say, just raise your hand and I will stop when I'm ready. But when you keep raising your hand, that tells me I can't wait, and you can, so just wait.
I am
10. Okay, so 56 delegates were a part of this First Continental Congress. At this meeting, the colonists weren't yet thinking about breaking away from England. Cal, that's too loud. They merely wanted to solve the problem of Boston's closed harbor. So here they're just trying to solve the problem. They're not thinking independence yet. They wanted to be represented in the British Parliament because they had been denied that. They wanted to be able to vote on things that were going on in there because what was being voted on was affecting them. The chant of the time was no taxation without representation, which is the same thing. Well, we had on our DC license plates, we have taxation without representation because we're taxed, but we're not represented in the Congress. But that's a discussion for another time. Though there was much disagreement on what to do with England, in 1 month's time, the delegates did agree on this. Until the British Parliament would listen to them, all the colonies would boycott trade with England and begin to build armed militia. Ooh.
I like this.
How did King George respond? Well, he said, the die is cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph. If this book had sound effects, I would add a faint drum roll, says Miss Harbour, because we're drawing closer. All right, so step number 4 is Patrick Henry's fiery speech. On March 23rd in 1775, when Patrick Henry was famously declared in Richmond, Virginia. He famously declared, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Okay, here's a picture of him speaking. We're going to read about it. I just wanted to read the caption. I like how the picture is a little bit dramatized. People are like,
Well, somebody's doing this.
responding to. Okay. Delegates from the First Continental Congress headed home with difficult work ahead of them. They needed to sell fellow colonists on the plan. That means they needed to convince the colonists of their plan to boycott England and to raise arms. Do you think everyone agreed? Of course not. Quite naturally, some were frightened of war and hesitant to stand against England, which was the homeland of 1/3 of the colonies. But some saw no other choice. Probably no other colonist spoke more passionately about the situation than Patrick Henry. He was an articulate lawyer. What does articulate mean?
He's able to communicate.
Yes, very well, his message. He and George Washington were both at the First Continental Congress, representing Virginia. Back home, when the Virginians met in Richmond to determine the response to England, Patrick Henry gave a speech. It ended with the famous words, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And these words were echoed strongly across all the colonies. All right, step number 5 is Paul Revere's Ride. We're going to read this one and then stop. Back in Boston, the colonists were keeping a close eye on the British Army. The British Army had a close eye on the colonists. They were both giving each other the eye. Remember, British troops had been present in the colonies since the French and Indian War. Well, the British troops discovered that colonists were stashing gunpowder in Concord. That was a Massachusetts town not far from Boston. This news was shared with General Thomas Gage, a British officer who had previously served along with George Washington in the French and Indian War. It was the duty of General Gage to stop the storing up of gunpowder and to disarm the colonists. So this right here, this is why Americans, not all Americans, but many Americans now are so passionate about having the right to have guns, is because the colonists weren't allowed to be armed, which prevents them from doing what?
Being able to defend themselves.
Yes, defend themselves, have a rebellion, rebel against a tyrannical ruler. However, the other side of the argument today is that the weaponry during this time was what? What's the difference between the weaponry then and the weaponry now?
The weaponry then was a bit more safer. It wasn't so violent. The weaponry now, there's huge, and
there's huge
bazookas.
Huge weapons that are meant to take out a lot of people all at once. We'll leave our language there. But then it was more like a musket,
There's a musket and a pistol. Those are like the only blasters.
So
that's
a lot different than a huge weapon. Yes.
Yes. Nowadays we have so back then it was a small wooden musket. Now we've got a huge EWB Class A.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we also have to keep in mind that no country wants their people to rebel. But at the same time, if you also have to keep in mind, if you are forcibly oppressing people, then that's not right either. So you have to find a balance to walk. But what's the balance that where should you look is what I'm asking, to find the balance. Where should you look?
The middle.
Yes, the middle. I meant the Bible.
Ooh.
You need to look to the principles of God. And I don't think that's done. We'll keep reading because I'm not exactly sure, because I've never looked at the American history from that perspective. Well, I have, but not this particular point. So we'll keep looking, but we want to keep our eye turned to, are they using biblical principles as justification? Are they how are they using God's word as their cornerstone? You're my corner. Okay. So let's see here. Where were we? General Gage, okay. So General Gage organized a British attack on Concord. The British were also out to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams because they were involved in the Boston Tea Party. Hancock and Adams were at the time in the town of Lexington, which was miles from Concord. They were in big trouble as the British were headed their way. Well, the watchful eye of Dr. Joseph Warren, he was one of the Sons of Liberty, saw the British attack coming. On April 18th in 1775, he called for 2 swift riders to get word out to the colonists that the British were advancing. The 2 riders were William Dawes and the ever-famous Paul Revere. Dawes stole behind British lines, going one direction, and Paul Revere went the other. To reach Hancock and Adams in Lexington, Paul Revere was taken by boat across the Charles River. He was given a horse on the other side and sent galloping off in the dark of the night. According to legend, Paul Revere supposedly knew what message to spread because of signal lanterns placed in the steeple of the Old North Church in Boston. Though historians are not sure if Revere ever saw these signals or if he was even the one for whom they were intended, 1 lantern in the church tower would mean the British were coming by land, 2 lanterns would mean they were coming by sea. As it turned out, 2 lanterns were shown from the church steeple that night, but only for a brief time so as not to alert the British. The lanterns effectively warned the colonists in the areas close to Boston that the British were on the move, while Revere and Dawes rode through the countryside with the message. Though folklore spreads the tale, Paul Revere never rode through the streets yelling the British are coming.
Mm-hmm.
Did Paul Revere warn the colonists of the British invasion in time to make a difference? Yes and no. He arrived in Lexington early enough to sneak Hancock and Adams out. But while he was en route from Lexington to Concord, Revere, Dawes, and a 3rd rider were captured by the British. Dawes and the new rider escaped, but Revere was detained and later released. Though not completely accurate, the classic poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, titled Paul Revere's Ride, famously commemorates this historic event. So she's saying the poem, which I think we've probably read at some point.
I've heard a little of it.
We'll probably need to read it. Is about the ride, but is not entirely accurate, is what she's saying. He adds a little extra.
On one of my audiobooks, on an audiobook that I listened to, I heard that the poem isn't exactly accurate.
Oh, okay. All right. Ooh, we're on page 51. We're stopping there. Good day.